Please be seated. Last week we received an excellent example of preaching historically found in the black church. Starting quiet and building to a fervor, lots of repetition, the placement of some very familiar Bible passages to help the hearer anticipate what the next word was going to be, drawing people into a frenzy at the last moment where you would accept the Lord into your heart, and you, as he said, because he brought these words very simply, would hand it over. My question for you is, how did that work for you this week? Did it work for you well this week? Anyone here get overwhelmed with anger, bitterness, resentfulness at any point this week? Anyone feel like their desire, their will was more important than God's? I'm guessing. Yup. At any point, did we lose sight of what it was? It was a great sermon. It's a shame we didn't listen to it. Well, we did listen to it. But life's difficult. We got to practice. You know, our reading from Exodus today is about God giving some commandments after breaking the previous ones, after breaking the previous ones, after breaking the previous ones. Let's be clear on all of this. And what happens after that is we keep breaking the ones that he gives us. The Bible is not about getting it perfect. The Bible's actually a very humbling book that our spiritual lives are difficult. So when I ask whether or not you got it, I'm not saying it to say you weren't listening to punish you, but we had a start. We had a start last week. Start of a journey that moves on and moves forward. A start of a journey that's about transformation. And just because you don't get it the first time doesn't mean you weren't listening. Examples were used using struggles in our everyday life. Examples were used using conflict in the Middle East. The funny thing is, as I've talked to a few people this week about things around the sermon, give it over to God is really easy to say. Right? Let's give it over to God. Easy to say. Give it to God. It's like 3 words. Easy. Give. Oh, that's 4. Yeah, it to God. There you go. That's 4 words. Give to God. That happens after the sermon. Oh, wait. That's an offertory joke for anyone who didn't get it. Give it to God. 4 words. Very simple to say. Hard to count. Very simple to say. And yet, it is the work of your life. Simple to say, challenging to do. When someone talks about handing it over to God, one of the first, it's one of my favorite speeches in history. I had to memorize it 30 years ago. I have forgotten it. I'm not going to memorize it. Again, I did it 30 years ago. That was enough. Abraham Lincoln, in his second inaugural address, towards the end of it, he says, specifically saying everybody in the North and the South didn't want this war to happen, right? This is what he's talking about. And he ends by saying that each country, North and South, or each part of the country, looked for an easier triumph and result less fundamental and astounding. Both, ready, here we go, this is my favorite part. both read the same Bible, and both pray to the same God, and each invokes God's aid against the other. It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces, but let us judge not, that we be not judged. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. The Almighty has his own purpose. He goes on to talk about how the war might be punishment to the country, both the North and the South, for ever allowing the institution of slavery to exist. But he ends with malice toward none and charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wound, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widows and his orphans, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and the nations. Lincoln was trying to figure out, how do you deal with two polar opposites that do not agree? Two polar opposites that are willing to kill each other. How do you care for both? How do you care for two polar opposites that are claiming to appeal to the exact same God? It is no wonder that with the Civil War, almost all the churches in the United States split. On its surface, one might ask actually a very simple question. Did they really worship the same God? They might have the same name, they might have the same book, but did they worship the same God? One worshiped a God that felt the institution of slavery was fair. One worshiped a God that felt the institution of slavery was not fair. I don't know about you. Seems like a pretty different God. What was it that made the God so different? I would argue is, when we read the Bible wanting to confirm what it is we believe. How's that? We read the Bible looking to have the Bible tell us we are right and they are wrong. We read the Bible so we can know that we're in the in club, and we can use it to tell the people who aren't in the club that they're not in the club. This is what was happening in the Civil War. This is what happens actually when you look at the history of how people use Scripture. Especially when we decide we're going to do manifest destiny and claim the Christian faith is right for everyone, and we're going to move people out of their homes, whether it is imperialism from the British, imperialism from the United States, imperialism from anyone. It's us saying, we are right and you are wrong. So we're going to hand it over to God. But do you know what we want to hand over to God? We want to hand over to God the stuff we don't like. We want to hand over to God when we're upset. We want God to make our lives easier. What we don't want to hand over to God is what we want. We don't hand over to God the desire. So we can go to Palestine, we can go to Israel, and we can find people who would claim they're handing it over to God, and they're saying, I'm throwing caution to the wind. I am trusting in God that my fight is righteous and holy, so long as I get what I want. And we're like this all the time with anger, with resentment. We don't have to look to the Middle East. We can look in our own lives. We can look in our own church. We can look at our own politics in our own country. People making claims that they are right and the other is so wrong that they won't even talk to one another. But that just doesn't work. In Bible study this week, there was a fun little statement that Elizabeth Dole claimed in her book, which is, whenever we get what we want, people aren't going to like this. You guys ready for this? Whenever we get what we want, to some degree, we reject God. Nobody likes hearing that. Whenever we get what we want, we reject God. In other words, God is asking us to live from the Spirit and ask us, and it's trite, right? We heard it in the 80s. It became marketing slogans and so forth. What would Jesus do? What is God calling us to do? When we are in the midst of being upset, when we are in the midst of saying, this is something that I want, how often do we ask ourselves, where is this in God's plan for me? How does this actually transform me into a more loving, better, good person? More often than not, what we want God to do is make it so we are right and the other person is wrong. And we want God to take away our anger at the other person by making the other person agree with us. That's what we want. It's not scriptural. The first step to handing it over to God is to reassess your basic assumptions. Prayerfully sit down and let go of the outcome. To not say, oh, if everybody did my will, the world would be perfect. But to take a step back, let go of the outcome, and ask a very simple question. Why does God want me to do this? How is this act loving, truthful, and supportive? I'm not saying that you're going to do this with everything. When you reach for a doorknob, you're not going to have this debate, right? You can't do it every second of the day. I'm not talking about the times of the day when you're going through autopilot and you're asking yourself, should I get a potato chip or not? I'm talking about the times where you find yourself fighting and pushing, and what if your first assumption wasn't I'm right, but I need to challenge myself that I'm wrong, learn to understand, seek the humility to ask how I'm being supportive and loving of the person that I'm in disagreement with. What would the world be like? What would Israel and Palestine be like if the tables weren't about property disputes, but about how do we care for the most number of people without the boundaries? What would our lives be like with the contention even with our loved ones? Sometimes, I don't know about you, but you have a bad day. You just want things to happen a certain way and you kind of jump on the people you love. Come on. It happens. What would it be if we were just better, more practiced at handing over to God? And the first step of doing that is to let go of the expectations and be honest. I've had a big bad day. I can't handle this right now. Or right now I really need your help. Or I want this, but I don't know if I should want this. What if we actually brought some of those presuppositions that are deep in our mind to the forefront of our lives? It's the first step. I'm sure there are more steps, but the first one is to prayerfully ask ourselves, not how do we get rid of the result, but how do we address what began it? In my life, I've found that anger is usually based on me not getting my way. I got angry driving a lot. I was a really angry driver. And it still pops out. Every once in a while it does. Because gosh darn it, it's my turn. In the history of the world, what does that matter? But I take it as a personal attack against me. When we are told the single most important commandment we are given is to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, thy soul, and thy mind, it's a radical reorganizing of priorities. That's an internal shift, by the way. That's not something anyone will ever see. It's manifest by the second commandment, which is, how do I treat you? How do I treat the things that I'm given? Do I honor where the stuff I have received has come from? Do I ask myself, is what I have supposed to be used in the way that I'm using it? That's the manifestation of, am I inward directed or outward directed? Do I care about me? Do I care about others? It's a journey, we're all walking it. If I ask you the question next week, I'm pretty sure you won't get it by then either. But maybe you'll be a little better. And then the next week, a little better. But the question I have for you is, what's the first step? When you're confronting anger, when you're confronting resentment, when you're confronting fear, what is it that you bring to God? Do you bring to God the ability to have your way be the way? Or do you really ask God to soften your heart, to listen more, to help you care how to nurture love and support? So this is your charge this week. As we are all becoming experts in giving things over to God, what conflict, what moment, what struggle will you hand over at the onset rather than the conclusion? Amen.